They say that after 60 years, a woman's face becomes a map of every war she's ever survived. My map is a bit more complicated than most. It's written in the shifting geography of my skin, the milky white patches of vitiligo that began at my fingertips and eventually climbed my neck, settling across my cheekbones like a permanent lace mask. To some, it's a medical condition. To my daughter, Alicia, it had become a source of profound, quiet shame. But there is a particular power in being the thing people want to look away from. When people are uncomfortable, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as furniture. And furniture hears everything. The air in the ballroom of the St. Regis was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne, the kind of smell that tries too hard to announce its price tag. It was the night of the rehearsal dinner, 24 hours before Alicia was set to marry Louis Rogers III. The Rogers were old money, the kind of family that viewed a tan as a sign of leisure, but viewed my skin as a distraction from their pristine aesthetic. I sat at a small, circular table near the kitchen doors, tucked behind a large floral arrangement. I wasn't at the head table. I wasn't even at the second-tier tables with the cousins. I was positioned exactly where the waitstaff began their rounds. I watched Alicia. She was radiant, polished to a high gloss, moving through the room with a practiced grace she hadn't learned from me. She was laughing at something Louis's mother, Linda, was saying. Linda was a woman who wore pearls like armor and looked at me as if I were a stain on a silk blouse. I saw the way Alicia's eyes flickered toward me, just for a second, before she quickly looked away, her smile tightening. It wasn't the look of a daughter loving her mother. It was the look of a curator spotting a flaw in a gallery. "Is the service to your liking, Mrs. Rogers?" I heard a voice behind me. It was the banquet manager. Before I could answer, Alicia appeared. She didn't walk. She glided, her silk dress whispering against the floor. She didn't look me in the eye. Instead, she looked at the manager, her voice pitched in that high, airy tone she used when she was performing sophistication. "Everything is perfect. Thank you," Alicia said, her hand resting lightly on the manager's arm. Then, she turned her gaze toward me, but it didn't land on my face. It landed on the white patches on my hands, resting atop the white tablecloth. "Could you please ensure that our domestic help remains focused on the beverage service near the terrace? We wouldn't want the guests waiting for their champagne because someone got distracted." The manager looked confused. He looked at my dress, deep navy silk, hand-tailored, costing more than Alicia's first car. Then he looked at Alicia. "Ma'am," he asked. Alicia leaned in, her voice a sharp, cold needle. "My mother's maid is quite shy," she said, gesturing vaguely toward me without making eye contact. "She's here to assist with the transition of the gifts and the coats. She doesn't need a menu. Just see to it she has a tray if she's going to be standing around." The silence that followed was heavy, at least for me. For the manager, it was an awkward professional moment. For Alicia, it was a strategic deletion. She had just erased 30 years of my life, the double shifts at the hospital, the tuition payments, the nights I spent scrubbing floors, so she would never have to with a single lie-filled sentence. She didn't call me a maid because she thought I was one. She called me a maid because in the world she was entering, a mother with spotted skin was a liability. A maid, however, was just a servant. And servants are invisible. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene that would have given her the satisfaction of calling me unstable. I simply picked up my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fear behind her bravado, the fear that she wasn't enough for the Rogers, and the belief that by burying me, she could climb higher. "The champagne is indeed running low on the terrace. Alicia," I said, my voice as calm as a graveyard at midnight. "You should be careful. When you spend all your time looking at the surface, you forget what's holding the floor up." And floors, they have a way of dropping out when you least expect it. She stiffened, a flicker of something, guilt perhaps, or maybe just annoyance, crossing her face. But Linda called her name. And just like that, my daughter turned her back on the maid and vanished into the crowd of gold and glitter. I sat there for a long time, watching the way the light caught the crystal. Most people think revenge is a hot, fast thing, a slap in the face, a shouted secret. But I've lived long enough to know that the best payback is like a slow-acting salt. It doesn't destroy the structure all at once. It just quietly eats away at the foundation until the whole house settles into the mud. Alicia thought she was playing a game of social climbing. She didn't realize that I was the one who taught her how to climb, and I knew exactly which rungs were rotten. As I watched her toast to her future, I reached into my small clutch bag and pulled out a single folded piece of paper, a document I had found in the Rogers family archives during my invisible time in their library weeks ago. The Rogers had secrets. Alicia had lies. And I had the patience of a woman who had spent 60 years learning that when people think you are nothing, they give you the keys to everything. I stood up, smoothed my navy silk, and walked toward the kitchen. If I was going to be the maid tonight, I might as well start cleaning. And I knew exactly where the dirt was buried. You see, the thing about being invisible is that you get to see what everyone else is trying to hide. And tomorrow, at the wedding of the season, I was going to make sure everyone saw the truth in high definition. The kitchen of the St. Regis is a symphony of controlled chaos. It's a place of sharp edges, steam, and people who are paid to be unnoticed. When I walked through those double swinging doors, the heat hit me like a physical weight, but I didn't flinch. To the staff, I was just another body in a dark suit. They didn't see the navy silk or the vitiligo. They saw a task. I found a quiet corner near the silver polishing station. A young man, barely 20, was mindlessly rubbing a cloth over a gravy boat. He looked tired. People in power forget that the tired are the most observant. The Rogers party is very particular about the vintage labels. I said softly, stepping into his line of sight. I didn't sound like a maid. I sounded like an authority they hadn't met yet. The 1996 reserves are being held in the lower cellar, not the main cooling room. Miss Alicia was quite clear about that. He looked up, blinking. He didn't question why I knew the bride's specific instructions. He just looked relieved to have a direction. "Oh, thank you, ma'am. I was wondering why the manifest looked off." "Details are everything," I replied, giving him a small, tight smile. I watched him hurry off. Then I turned my attention to the service elevator. Alicia had spent the last year meticulously crafting her new identity. She had scrubbed her social media, changed her accent, and told the Rogers that her father was a deceased diplomat. And tonight she had decided I was the help. But Alicia's flaw has always been her arrogance. She thinks she's the only one who can reinvent herself. She forgot that I was the one who raised her in the shadows of the truth. I took the elevator down to the basement level. The Rogers had rented out the entire hotel for the weekend, and their private office was tucked away near the wine cellar. Louis Rogers, too, the father of the groom, was a man who believed that paper trails were for the poor. He kept everything on a secure server, or so he thought. But Louis Sr. was old school. He liked the feel of a ledger. I walked toward the office, my footsteps silent on the industrial linoleum. I knew the code to the door because I had watched Louis's assistant type it in 3 days ago while I sat in the lobby, ostensibly waiting for Alicia. For -2-9-1, the date of his first successful corporate raid. Men like Louis are predictable in their vanity. The room was cool and smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. I moved to the mahogany desk and opened the bottom drawer. It wasn't locked. Arrogance is a lack of imagination. Louis couldn't imagine anyone in this building would have the nerve to touch his things. I pulled out the folder I had seen before. It was a prenuptial agreement, but not the one Alicia had signed. This was the real one, the one Louis had prepared for his son, without Alicia's knowledge. I sat in his leather chair, the light from the desk lamp casting long, distorted shadows of my hands across the documents. In the Rogers world, marriage wasn't a union, it was an acquisition. This document stated that in the event of a divorce, Alicia would receive nothing. No alimony, no property, no parting gifts. But there was a more interesting clause, a morality and heritage rider. It stated that if any undisclosed hereditary or genetic conditions were discovered that could compromise the Rogers lineage, the marriage would be annulled immediately, and the party in breach would be liable for the entire cost of the wedding and any social damages. Alicia had lied to them about her medical history. She had told them the vitiligo was a result of a childhood accident, a chemical burn. She was so afraid of being imperfect in their eyes that she had handed them a noose. But that wasn't the best part. As I flipped through the private ledger tucked behind the folder, I found what I was really looking for. Louis Rogers wasn't just old money, he was dirty money. There were entries here, payments to offshore accounts, consulting fees to city officials, that would make the IRS salivate. It seems the Rogers' pristine reputation was held together by the same thing Alicia used to cover her skin, a very thick layer of expensive makeup. I pulled a small, portable scanner from my bag, a gift to myself for my 60th birthday. I didn't rush. I scanned every page of the ledger, every clause of the secret prenup. My hands were steady. The white patches on my skin looked like ivory against the dark paper. Suddenly, the door handle turned. I didn't panic. I didn't hide. I simply stood up and walked toward the door, timing my arrival perfectly. As the door opened, I was already there, holding a stack of empty manila folders I'd grabbed from the desk. It was Linda Rogers. She stopped, her eyes narrowing as they landed on me. "What are you doing in here?" "You're the woman from the table." "The maid, ma'am," I said, my voice low and deferential. I bowed my head just enough to hide the gleam in my eyes. The bride asked me to find the extra seating charts. She was concerned about the morning brunch. Linda's lip curled in a mixture of pity and disgust. Alicia really should keep her people on a shorter leash. This is a private office. Get out. Now. Of course, Mrs. Rogers. My apologies. I brushed past her, the scanner tucked safely in my waistband, the weight of their destruction pressed against my spine. As I walked back toward the service elevator, I could feel Linda's eyes on my back. She thought she was watching a servant retreat in shame. She had no idea she was watching the fuse being lit. Alicia wanted a life built on a lie. She wanted a family that valued purity above all else. Fine. I would give her exactly what she asked for. I would give her a wedding that no one in this city would ever forget. I reached the lobby and saw Alicia across the room, laughing with Louis III. She looked so secure, so triumphant. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally silenced the mother who reminded her of where she came from. I felt a strange sense of peace. The tension that had lived in my chest for years, the hurt of her rejection, the sting of her shame, it was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, mathematical certainty. I walked out of the St. Regis and into the cool night air. The city was glowing, but all I saw were the shadows. Tomorrow, at the I do's, the world would see exactly what kind of foundation the Rogers and my daughter had built. The first step was done. The evidence was secured. Now, I just had to decide who to invite to the showing. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, heavy, silent, and promising a storm. I spent the early hours in a small, nondescript coffee shop 3 blocks away from the St. Regis. I wasn't hiding, I was calibrating. In my world, timing isn't just a preference, It's the difference between a ripple and a tidal wave. I sat by the window, my hands wrapped around a porcelain mug. The vitiligo on my knuckles looked like marble in the gray morning light. For years, Alicia had tried to convince me to wear gloves, to use heavy camouflage creams, to just blend in. She never understood that blending in is a form of surrender. I prefer to be a landmark, something you have to navigate around. By 10 a.m., the floral deliveries were clogging the entrance of the hotel. Thousands of white roses stripped of their thorns, as if nature itself had to be declawed to suit the Rogers family's temperament. I watched from across the street as the elite of the city began to arrive. Black SUVs hissed at the curb, disgorging women in fascinators and men in suits that cost more than my first mortgage. I checked my phone. The digital files I had scanned the night before were already sitting in 3 different inboxes, scheduled to be released at a very specific moment. One to a local investigative journalist who had been trying to pierce the Rogers philanthropy shell for years. One to a high-profile divorce attorney known for his appetite for scandals. And the third was for someone much closer to home. I walked back into the hotel through the delivery entrance. I didn't need a badge or an invitation. I wore a simple, impeccably tailored black dress and a small pillbox hat with a veil. The veil wasn't to hide my face. It was to create a sense of mourning. After all, I was about to witness a death, the death of a daughter's fantasy. I made my way to the bridal suite on the 12th floor. The hallway was a frantic buzz of bridesmaids in champagne silk, smelling of hairspray and nervous perspiration. None of them looked at me. To them, an older black woman in a dark dress was simply part of the infrastructure, a seamstress perhaps, or a member of the housekeeping staff. I stood outside the heavy oak doors of the suite. Inside, I could hear Alicia's voice. It was sharp, brittle. It's not straight. The lace on the train is bunching. Where is the stylist? She's coming. Alicia, breathe, one of the bridesmaids whispered. I can't breathe. Do you know what Linda said to me this morning? She told me to make sure I wore enough foundation on my neck, so I don't look patchy in the candelabra light. She thinks it's contagious. If she finds out the truth is whatever you say it is, the friend replied. Your mother isn't even here to ruin it. You handled that last night. I leaned my head against the cool wood of the door. Handled. That was the word she used for her mother. Like a spill. Like a mistake. I felt no anger. Only a profound, chilling clarity. Alicia hadn't just rejected my skin. She had rejected the resilience it represented. She wanted the Rogers name because she thought it was a shield. She didn't realize she was hiding behind a pane of glass. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small white envelope. Inside was a copy of the Morality and Heritage rider I had scanned from the basement. I slid it under the door. It made a soft, sibilant sound as it skidded across the plush carpet inside. The voices stopped. A moment later, the door creaked open. Alicia stood there, half-dressed in her $20,000 gown, her hair pinned in intricate, gravity-defying loops. She saw me, and her face went through a rapid succession of emotions. Shock, rage, and then a cold, calculating fear. She was holding the paper in her hand. What is this? She hissed, stepping into the hallway and closing the door behind her, so her friends couldn't hear. How did you get this? I'm the maid, remember? I said, my voice barely a whisper. Maids find things in the trash, in the drawers, in the corners where the important people don't look. You're trying to blackmail me? Alicia's eyes were wild. On my wedding day? My own mother? I'm not blackmailing you. Alicia, blackmail is for people who want something. I don't want your money, and I certainly don't want your new family. I stepped closer until I could see the tiny cracks in her makeup. I'm just giving you a choice. You can walk down that aisle knowing that Louis's father has already prepared for your failure. He's already decided you are a breach of contract. Or you can tell the truth. The truth doesn't exist in this world, she spat. The Rogers don't want the truth. They want a pedigree. And I've worked too hard to let a woman who looks like a Rorschach test take it away from me. I didn't flinch at the insult. I simply looked at the paper in her hand. The Rorschach test usually tells you more about the person looking at it than the ink itself. Today, Alicia, the world is going to look at you very closely. Get out, she said, her voice trembling. If I see you near the ceremony, I'll have security throw you out. I mean it. You are nothing to me. I was never nothing, Alicia, I said, turning to walk away. I was the foundation, and you've spent the last year chipping away at it. I'm just here to see what happens when the last piece goes. I didn't look back. I headed toward the elevators, the weight of the digital files I had set in motion feeling like a heavy velvet cloak. Alicia thought the threat was the paper in her hand. She didn't realize that the paper was just a courtesy, a warning shot. The real storm was already in the wires, moving through the city, waiting for the moment the music started. As I stepped into the elevator, I caught my reflection in the mirrored doors. My skin was vivid, stark, and beautiful in its complexity. I wasn't a maid. I wasn't a mistake. I was the architect of the next hour. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis had been transformed into a cathedral of glass and white velvet. It was a masterpiece of exclusion. Every chair was assigned, every nameplate etched in gold, every guest vetted for their net worth or their social standing. I stood in the back, shadowed by a heavy velvet curtain, watching the theater of it all. To the security guards, I was the woman Alicia had pointed out earlier, the help who needed to be watched. They stayed at a distance, their radios crackling with the mundane logistics of a millionaire's union. They didn't realize that while they were watching me, I was watching the doors. At exactly 2 p.m., the uninvited began to arrive. The first was a man named Robert Thompson. He was thin, silver-haired, and carried an air of exhausted integrity. He was the investigative journalist I had emailed. He didn't have an invitation, but he had something better. A digital copy of the Rogers ledger I had sent him, including the entries that linked Louis Rogers to the city's recent waterfront development scandal. He walked past the greeters with a press badge and a look of grim determination. Security tried to intercept him, but he simply held up his phone. He wasn't there for the cake. He was there for the kill. Then came the others, a group of former employees from Rogers's private equity firm, men and women who had been restructured out of their pensions while Louis bought his son a third yacht. I had found their names in the legal settlements folder in the basement. I had sent them the location and a simple message. The man who stole your future is celebrating his today. They didn't come in suits. They came in their Sunday best, their faces lined with the kind of hard-earned wisdom that the Rogers had spent a lifetime avoiding. They gathered in the foyer, a silent, growing wall of witnesses. I saw Linda Rogers descend the grand staircase, her face pale. She saw the commoners gathering in her pristine lobby. She signaled for the head of security, her gestures frantic. But before the guards could move, the music began. The arrival of the Queen of Sheba. A bit on the nose, even for Alicia. The double doors at the back of the hall swung open. Alicia appeared, a vision of white silk and lies. She began her walk down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Louis III, who stood at the altar looking like a man who had never faced a consequence in his life. As she passed me, the veil of my hat caught the light. For a split second, our eyes met. She saw me. She saw the ghosts I had invited. And for the first time, I saw the cracks in her foundation turn into canyons. She stumbled just a micro-movement before her training took over, and she kept walking. I stepped out from behind the curtain. I didn't follow her down the aisle. I walked toward the audiovisual booth tucked into the side of the ballroom. The young technician there was busy adjusting the levels for the vows. He didn't see me until I was standing right beside him. The bride requested a change to the photo montage. I said, "My voice is smooth as river stone." She wants the heritage slides played during the processional. It's a surprise for the Rogers. The boy looked at me, confused. I didn't get a work order for that. "Check your internal drive," I whispered. "The file is labeled Legacy." I had uploaded it remotely using the hotel's guest Wi-Fi an hour ago, using the credentials I borrowed from Lewis's assistant. The boy clicked the mouse. He saw the file. He saw the Rogers family crest on the first slide. He shrugged, figuring the rich were just being eccentric again, and hit Q. I turned back to the room. Alicia had reached the altar. The priest began to speak, his voice booming through the high-end speakers. "If anyone knows any reason why these two should not be wed." It's a standard line, a formality, usually followed by a polite, expectant silence. But as the priest spoke, the massive 20-foot LED screens flanking the altar flickered to life. They didn't show photos of Alicia as a baby or Lewis at Yale. The first slide was a high-resolution scan of the morality and heritage rider. The clause about undisclosed genetic conditions was highlighted in a searing digital yellow. The room went cold. I could hear the collective intake of breath, a sharp, jagged sound. Louis III looked at the screen, then at Alicia. Linda Rogers stood up, her pearls clutched so tight, I thought they might shatter. "What is this?" Louis II shouted from the front row, his voice echoing off the marble. Alicia turned, her face a mask of horror. She looked at the screen, then her eyes searched the back of the room. She found me. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I simply stood there, a woman of 60 years, wearing my skin like a badge of office. The second slide appeared. It wasn't about Alicia. It was a spreadsheet from the Rogers ledger. It listed the bribes paid to the Port Authority. It listed the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. It listed the names of the people standing in the foyer, the people Lewis had stepped on to build this palace. The maid had finished the cleaning. And now, the trash was on full display. The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized. It was the kind of silence that precedes a structural failure, where you can almost hear the molecules of a reputation splintering. In the high-vaulted ceiling of the St. Regis, the only sound was the hum of the cooling fans behind the LED screens, a digital heartbeat for a dying social contract. Louis Rogers, too, was the first to break. He didn't look at the guests or the priest or even his son. He looked at the screen with the predatory focus of a man who had spent 40 years erasing his tracks, only to find them paved in neon. His face, usually a mask of tanned, expensive composure, slackened. The spreadsheet on the screen wasn't just a list of numbers. It was a roadmap to a federal indictment. "Turn it off," Lewis hissed, his voice cracking. "Turn that garbage off." The young technician in the booth panicked. His fingers flew across the keyboard, but I had seen to it that the legacy file wasn't just a slideshow. It was a looped executable with a secondary override. The more he clicked, the more the images proliferated. Now, the screens weren't just showing the ledger. They were showing the morality and heritage rider side by side with the offshore account numbers. The juxtaposition was poetic. The Rogers obsession with purity in their bloodline was being projected right next to the impurity of their bank accounts. Alicia stood at the altar, her white veil trembling. She looked like a ghost in her own life. She turned to Louis III, her hands reaching out, but he stepped back. It wasn't a large movement, but in the choreography of a wedding, it was a divorce before the marriage had even begun. He wasn't looking at her skin. He was looking at the rider, the proof that his own father had viewed his bride as a business transaction with a return policy. "You knew," Louis III whispered, his voice amplified by the lapel mic he was still wearing. "You knew my father had a breach of contract clause for our children?" Alicia's mouth moved, but no sound came out. The sophistication she had spent years cultivating had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified girl who had traded her mother for a seat at a table that was currently being chopped into kindling. In the back of the room, Robert Thompson, the journalist, was no longer standing still. He was holding his phone up, recording the screens, his thumb flying as he live-tweeted the Rogers collapse to 1 million followers. The uninvited guests, the former employees, had moved into the center aisle. They weren't shouting. They didn't need to. Their presence was a physical weight, a debt that had finally come due. Linda Rogers finally found her legs. She marched toward the A/V booth, her heels clicking like gunfire on the marble. She saw me standing there, leaning against the doorframe. "You," she gasped, her face a mottled purple that almost matched the orchids in her bouquet. "I knew you were a mistake. I knew the moment I saw you. You're a cancer. You've ruined everything." I didn't move. I didn't even raise my voice. I didn't write the ledger, Linda. I didn't draft the writer. I just provided the light. If the room looks ugly now, it's not because of the lamp. It's because of what's been hiding in the dark. She reached out as if to slap me, but she stopped. Perhaps it was the calm in my eyes. Or perhaps she realized that hitting a 60-year-old woman in front of a room full of cameras was the one thing that would make this disaster worse. She lowered her hand, her fingers shaking. "Alicia will never recover from this." Linda hissed, "You've destroyed your own daughter." "No," I said, looking past her to where Alicia was sinking to her knees on the white velvet runner. "I've stopped her from becoming you. That's the greatest gift a mother can give." The room was no longer a wedding. It was an exit. Guests were beginning to stand, whispering, their eyes darting toward the doors. The Rogers were no longer the sun they all orbited. They were a black hole, and no one wanted to be pulled in. I watched as Louis II grabbed his wife's arm and began to pull her toward the side exit, his head down, the lion of the city reduced to a scavenger scurrying for a hole. He didn't look at his son. He didn't look at Alicia. He only looked at the door. The music had stopped. The technician had finally pulled the plug, and the screens went black, leaving a strange green afterimage in the air. Alicia remained at the altar, alone. The bridesmaids had retreated like silk-clad shadows. She looked up and saw me walking down the side aisle. I wasn't rushing. I was observant, patient, and inevitable. She looked at me, and for the first time in 10 years, she didn't look through me. She saw the woman who had scrubbed the floors. She saw the woman who had paid the tuition. And she saw the woman who had just burned her world to the ground to save her soul. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Because, Alicia," I said, stopping at the edge of the altar, "you can't build a palace on a swamp and get mad when the walls start to lean. I told you, floors have a way of dropping out." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, damp cloth. I stepped up onto the dais. I took her hand, the hand that was supposed to wear the Rogers diamond, and I wiped away the heavy, expensive foundation she had used to hide the white patches on her own wrist. Underneath, the skin was beautiful. It was hers. It was mine. "Now," I said softly, "the cleaning is done. Let's go home." The St. Regis Ballroom, which only an hour ago felt like the center of the high society universe, now felt like a hollowed-out ribcage. The guests had vanished with a speed that only the truly wealthy can manage when scandal breaks, like cockroaches scattering when a light flickers on. The air was still heavy with the scent of 5,000 dying roses, but the silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic clicking of a frantic publicist's heels in the marble foyer. Alicia sat on the edge of the altar steps, her voluminous white skirt spilled around her like a broken cloud. She looked at her wrist, the patch of skin I had uncovered. The white mark was stark against her brown skin, a small island of truth in a sea of expensive lace. She didn't cover it. She just stared at it, her chest heaving in shallow, jagged breaths. "They're gone," she whispered. Louis III had followed his father out the side entrance 10 minutes ago. He hadn't even looked back. He didn't leave because of the vitiligo. He left because the Rogers name had just become toxic. And a man like Louis is taught from birth that when the ship sinks, you don't save the passengers. You find the nearest lifeboat. "They were never here, Alicia," I said, sitting beside her. I didn't touch her. I knew the weight of my presence was enough. They were here for the performance. Once the script changed, they didn't know their lines anymore. "You ruined my life," she said, but the venom was gone. It was replaced by a flat, hollow exhaustion. "I ruined a lie. I corrected. There's a difference. A life is what you have left when the lying stops. Right now, you're more alive than you've been since you turned 22 and decided my house wasn't aesthetic enough for your Instagram." She let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a sob. She reached up and began pulling the diamond-encrusted pins from her hair, tossing them onto the velvet runner. They hit the floor with tiny, expensive thuds. "The press is outside. I saw them through the window. Thompson, that man you invited, he's going to run everything. The offshore accounts, the bribes, my medical history. He's going to run the truth," I said. "And the Rogers will spend the next 10 years in courtrooms instead of ballrooms. They won't have time to sue you for breach of heritage because they'll be busy trying to stay out of federal prison." I stood up and smoothed my dress. I felt lighter than I had in decades. The maid had finished her shift, and the house was finally empty of its rot. "I have a car waiting at the service entrance," I told her. "Not a limousine, a sedan. It's paid for, and the driver doesn't care who you are or what your skin looks like. You can come with me, or you can stay here and wait for the Rogers lawyers to serve you the annulment papers. Because believe me, Linda is already drafting them in the back of that SUV." Alicia looked up at the darkened LED screens. The green afterimage was gone, leaving only black glass. She looked at the $20,000 dress, now stained with the dust of a floor she had once been too proud to walk on. She reached for my hand. Her fingers were trembling, but her grip was tight. For the first time in years, she didn't care about the patches on my skin. She was just a daughter reaching for the only thing in the room that wasn't made of glass. "Wait," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She reached into the folds of her skirt and pulled out the engagement ring, a 5-carat pear-shaped diamond that looked like a cold, hard tear. She looked at it for a long moment, then placed it carefully on the spot where she had been standing when she said her vows. "Let them have their purity," she whispered. We walked out together, moving through the kitchen where I had started my night. The staff moved aside, their eyes wide, watching the bride and the woman they thought was a servant walk out into the gray afternoon. The storm I had felt coming all morning finally broke as we hit the sidewalk. The rain was cold and sudden, washing the heavy makeup from Alicia's face, turning the white silk of her dress into a heavy, translucent gray. We climbed into the back of the sedan. As the driver pulled away, I looked back at the St. Regis. The golden lights of the lobby were still glowing, but from here they looked small, fading. "Where are we going?" Alicia asked. "To a place where nobody knows your name," I said, "and where nobody cares about the map on your skin. We're going to start the slow work of being real." I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes. The revenge wasn't the scandal. It wasn't the ruined wedding or the fallen dynasty. The revenge was the silence in the car, the quiet, absolute power of a woman who had finally stopped being invisible and started being the storm. The safe house, a small brick cottage I'd owned under my maiden name for 30 years, smelled of beeswax and old books. It was the antithesis of the St. Regis. Here, The floors creaked with history, and the mirrors didn't demand perfection. They only offered reflections. Alicia sat at the kitchen table, draped in one of my oversized wool cardigans. Her wedding dress, a sodden heap of ruined ambition, lay in a trash bag by the door. She looked smaller now, stripped of the contouring and the Spanx and the expectations of a dynasty that never truly wanted her. She was staring at a bowl of soup I'd heated up, the steam curling around her face like a ghost. "They're calling it the Street Point Regis Massacre on the news," she said, her voice hollow. She didn't have her phone. I'd made her leave it in the hotel room, but the small television in the corner was muted, showing a loop of Lewis Sr. shielding his face from a swarm of reporters. The Rogers stock dropped 12 points in 4 hours. The feds are already at their estate in Greenwich. I sat across from her, sipping tea. Panic is a loud neighbor. Alicia, it moves fast, but it burns out. What remains is the ledger. And the ledger doesn't lie. "You had that for weeks," she said, finally looking at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but the fog was clearing. "The scans, the evidence. You could have stopped the wedding a month ago. You could have saved me the humiliation of standing there in front of everyone." I set my cup down with a deliberate click. "If I had shown you that ledger a month ago, you would have taken it to Lewis. You would have used it as leverage to secure your position. You would have traded my protection for their approval. You weren't ready to see them for what they were. You needed to feel the floor give way to understand that you were standing on nothing." She flinched. It was a hard truth, a bitter pill that stuck in the throat. But she didn't argue. She knew I was right. Alicia had always been a climber, and a climber doesn't look down until they fall. "What happens to me now?" she asked. "I'm a Rogers in name only, and that name is currently a synonym for fraud. I have no job, no money, and half the city thinks I'm a social climber who got caught in the gears." "You are Alicia Thompson," I said, using my own name, the name she had spent a decade trying to bury. "And as for money, you forget who raised you. I didn't spend 40 years as a head nurse just to have a pension. I've been moving pieces on this board since before you met Lewis. You have a trust, one the Rogers can't touch, because it was never tied to their world." I pushed a manila envelope across the table. It wasn't filled with scandals this time. It was filled with a deed to a small gallery space in a neighborhood that didn't care about old money. "The world thinks you're a victim or a villain," I said, "but silence is a luxury. While they're busy talking about you, you're going to be busy building something that can't be taken away by a prenup. You have a talent for curation. Alicia, use it for something real this time." She opened the envelope, her fingers tracing the map of the new floor plan. I watched her, observing the way her shoulders finally dropped. The tension that had defined her since her teenage years, the constant, frantic need to be more, was being replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. "And Lewis?" she asked softly. "Lewis is a shadow," I said, "and shadows disappear when you turn on the light. He'll spend his life trying to reclaim a grace that never existed. You, however, have the sun." I stood up and walked to the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the moon was fighting its way through the clouds. My skin, with its white patches, caught the pale light. I didn't look like a maid. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a woman who had finally cleared the weeds from her garden. "The Rogers thought they were buying a daughter-in-law," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "They didn't realize they were inviting a storm into their parlor. And storms don't leave until the air is clean." Alicia stood up and walked over to me. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She just stood beside me. Our reflections mingled in the dark glass of the window. Two women, marked by the same history, finally standing on solid ground. "We have work to do," she said. "Tomorrow," I replied. "Tonight, we just breathe." A year is a long time in the memory of a city, but it is a heartbeat in the life of a woman who knows how to wait. I sat in the back of the Thompson and Company gallery, the smell of fresh linseed oil and expensive espresso a far cry from the suffocating lilies of the St. Regis. The space was minimalist, exposed brick, warm wood, and lighting that didn't hide anything. On the walls hung a series of large-scale portraits. Women of all ages, their skin a kaleidoscope of vitiligo, scars, and birthmarks. They didn't look like victims. They looked like masterpieces. I watched Alicia through the glass office door. She was dressed in a simple, charcoal gray jumpsuit, her hair natural and short. She wasn't wearing foundation. The white lace of her skin moved across her jawline as she spoke to a benefactor, her gestures fluid and unburdened. She had become the curator of her own life, and in doing so, she had become untouchable. The Rogers, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale whispered in the very circles they once ruled. Lewis Sr. was currently navigating the third month of a high-profile trial for racketeering and tax evasion. Linda had retreated to a small rental in a town where no one knew her name, her pearls likely sitting in a pawn shop to pay for her husband's legal defense. And Louis III, he was a ghost, a man whose only inheritance was a surname that made people turn their heads in the opposite direction. The maid had finished the deep clean, and the air had never been crisper. I felt a presence beside me, and didn't need to turn to know who it was. Robert Thompson stood there, looking at the center portrait, the one Alicia had insisted on taking of me. In the photo, I am looking directly into the camera, my hands resting on my lap, the ivory patches of my skin looking like light hitting water. "It's the most talked about piece in the city, Mrs. Thompson," Robert said quietly. "People come in here expecting to see a tragedy. They walk out feeling like they're the ones who are missing something." "Perspective is a powerful weapon, Robert," I replied, my voice steady and calm. "Most people spend their lives trying to fit into a frame that wasn't built for them. It's much more efficient to simply build your own gallery." He nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The Rogers lawyers called me again yesterday. They're still trying to find the source of the ledger. They're convinced it was a high-level hack, an international conspiracy." I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. Let them search. Men like that can't fathom that their downfall came from the woman who handed them their champagne. They're looking for a monster in the clouds when they should have been looking at the person cleaning their floors. Robert tipped his head in respect and moved off into the crowd. I stayed in my chair, observant and still. I had no more moves to make. The strategy had been executed, the consequences had landed, and the reversal of power was absolute. Alicia caught my eye from across the room. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. She just gave me a small, knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement of the bridge we had burned and the one we had built in its place. Revenge, when done correctly, isn't a scream. It's the sound of a key turning in a lock after the house has been cleared of its ghosts. It's the ability to sit in a room and know that you are finally, irrevocably, the master of the space you occupy. I stood up, smoothed my black silk trousers, and walked toward the door. My work here was done. The world would keep spinning, scandals would come and go, but the Rogers would never forget the woman they tried to make invisible. Because the thing about being a shadow is that you are the only one who truly knows where the light comes from. And I have always been the sun. If this story resonated with you, remember, never underestimate the person who sees everything while you see nothing. Subscribe to Old School Payback for more stories of calculated justice. Tell me in the comments, what's the one secret you'd never want a maid to find?